Hello, everybody, and welcome to our weekly Marketer Live session hosted by MarketerHire. We are here today with Ed Fu, the former CMO over at ZipRecruiter, and also the founder of Happy Masks, which is something very important that we all need or have all needed over the last while. So we're very, very excited to have him here with us today. Of course, going to be talking about, how he thinks about building marketing teams, incredibly effective organizations. Before we dive into that, I do want to give another very quick shout out to our good friends over at the Webby Awards, who are sponsoring this series as part of the larger Future of Work series, right? What does it look like? Are we going to be going back to offices? Are people going to be remote? Is there going to be some kind of hybrid model? Beyond that, how, are hiring practices changing as a result of COVID, but also just as a result of technology changing really quickly. So we'll dive into that a little bit here. Ed, thank you so much for being here with us.
Sure thing. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, so very first question on the docket, which is kind of the first question that I ask everybody, which is, when you joined ZipRecruiter, what did that marketing org chart look like?
Yeah, we started off. I mean, it's very relevant to the size of the company at the time. I won't quote specific numbers, but we were operating on one channel successfully, trying to explore other channels. Business was fairly sizable. It wasn't like an early stage startup. We had about 90 people or so, but in terms of marketing complexity, it was fairly straightforward. So the team really looked kind of like a startup team. We had one person who was managing our existing channel that was working, which is search, and then the rest of the team was about 5 or 6 people total. Really looked like a growth team where we had a designer, 2 developers, and 1 or 2 people really looking to explore new channels. So we called it like a little SWAT growth team, where most people were generalists in nature, but we had the basic units of a team to be able to do anything from buy media, test new things, spin up landing pages, and just really be able to figure out if we can get new channels to work in our funnel.
Yeah. Well, so you are the first guest that I've talked to so far who has mentioned developers as being an important part of a growth team. And I've been on growth teams in the past, and as a result have worked really closely with developers. It's hard to get live without them in a lot of different capacities. Those developers, were they developers that had deep marketing backgrounds? How did they kind of fit on that growth team, and who were they working closely with?
Yeah, they didn't necessarily have marketing experience. We had one front-end developer, one back-end developer. And really they were just great, fast-moving generalists who can spin up concepts very quickly, right? Because marketing it's not just about, hey, here's a message and here's an ad, let me just drive it to the existing homepage or the landing pages we have. A lot of times you're testing new concepts or new ways to capture leads that may be more creative than your standard message. And what developers enabled us to do was just to not constrain our creativity and not be limited to just tools like Unbounce, which are great tools, but I think that's more if you have more certainty around what you're trying to do, versus there's a lot of ways you can drive new customers. At least at ZipRecruiter, there were a lot of creative ways we could try and experiment with. So the developers really gave us the freedom to develop. I would call them products essentially, right? Because sometimes they were lightweight products that were closely tied to marketing messages. I'll give you one example. If you wanted to calculate your estimated salary, for example, right? That requires some development work that isn't just, oh, let me move the buttons around a little bit. I think using something like Unbounce is good if you're looking for those final 10% optimizations, but we were looking for 30% wins, 50% wins. And so it made sense at the time to have a growth team that had dev resources.
I love that so much. And I'm so glad that you brought up tools, because I have also used tools in particular, kind of in combination, with like content marketing and a developer to get tools like that, calculators or whatever else it might be out to the market. So you mentioned before that the team was kind of structured in terms of like search and then like a growth kind of SWAT team. Now, was that search paid search? Was it organic search? Was it all of it? How did that work?
It was all of search. We had someone who was, very adept at search, who was just managing that But he was also involved in exploring new channels as well. But that team quickly changed once we figured out new channels. It was there for maybe a few months, and then once we figured out new channels, the entire team had to evolve and change very rapidly.
Okay, well, talk to me about that then. So I mean, my next question for you really is, what is that first role that you hired at ZipRecruiter, and why that role? Though I have a feeling it's going to be related to you figured out which channel, like what other channels were working.
Yeah. So I would say it's less about the way I think about it, the way we thought about it at ZipRecruiter was the hardest part is to figure out a new channel. It's to go from 0 to 1 because it's uncertain and there's a lot of risk and no one likes failing and you're trying things that you're learning for the first time, right? And so the way we thought about it was that the main, call it like mini leadership team within marketing, we were responsible for figuring out new channels. We weren't trying to outsource it to, hey, you know podcasts really well, go figure it out. We had to engineer and figure it out ourselves, but we leveraged people who knew that channel well to execute for us, right? And to bring us up to speed. So with that backdrop, the first few new channels we figured out were really offline channels. We were one of the first companies. This was 6-7 years ago. We were one of the first startups to really leverage offline media when everyone was only focused on online media at the time. And one of the first channels that became a huge success for us was audio. So radio, podcasts, both traditional radio as well as satellite and new forms of radio like podcasts. And we really actually leveraged agencies in the beginning because they were already plugged into the infrastructure to be able to help us execute tests quickly. So that's how we got started. We said, okay, we need to think on a first principles basis to figure out if radio will work for our business, if the unit economics will work for our business. But we leveraged outside resources in the beginning just to move quickly. Yeah. Right. And it gave us a flexibility because if it worked, then we could then figure out, okay, well, what are the skills we need to really fully develop, competency in this channel? If it didn't work, then okay, we hired an agency so we can just move on from them, right? So that was the decision framework at that time.
Right. I like that. Now, ZipRecruiter is in a unique position as a company, at least from the outside looking in, that you also kind of get insights into the way other companies recruit as a result of kind of being a recruiting platform yourself. Was there anything that like your team learned watching other organizations recruit, kind of do's and don'ts there?
I would say not really, only because the way a high growth, venture scale company grows is very different than the average small business that's recruiting someone to be a waiter at a restaurant or be a customer service representative. So it's very different. So we did not get that level of insight. It was more sort of broad spectrum in terms of we saw trends in how businesses across the economy were hiring, but not nuanced to a level of, okay, how do teams hire for marketers?
Right. Okay, fair enough. You though are also an angel investor. How do you kind of view your portfolio of companies hiring, and how do you advise there, especially having led a marketing team before? Are there any do's and don'ts that you chat folks through there?
Yeah, I think a lot of this really depends on the stage of the company, but in general, most of the consumer focus companies I've invested in, everyone needs to start with digital because it's easily measurable. The amounts you need to outlay are very small just to start with, and so you can test and experiment and understand if you have product market fit or how you can scale your growth in a very sort of low risk way. And then, and every founder has this problem of, okay, well, I kind of know Facebook. I don't really know it that well. I know Google. I mean, there's really two big channels in digital. It's Google and Facebook, and you want to try both of them. And some founders are really smart and they just try and do it themselves, which you can. The tools are easy enough that you can start running marketing yourself. But in general, I just tell them, hey, find someone who knows Facebook or Google well. Find a freelancer who can just help you run the experiment, because you don't necessarily need a growth person at the team yet. You just need to know from a broad stroke standpoint, do you have product market fit, and are your unit economics on a work on a particular channel? In that case, you want to maximize flexibility because you don't know which channel is going to work. So I usually recommend, hey, if you're not in one channel yet, then you want to explore supplementing yourself with a set of freelancers that can help you quickly test and run experiments across different channels, right? That gives you the most flexibility to go fast and to cover a broad spectrum of channels. But once you figure something out, then that's a different set of criteria to figure out what the hiring plan is. And that's evolved over time too. Like what I used, my philosophy at ZipRecruiter has definitely changed in terms of how we look for people, how you look for people now. It's evolving quickly.
Yeah. Well, so how do you look for people now? Like talk to me about like what shifted from then to now in terms of, what kind of marketers you're looking for, how you're thinking about those teams. How's that philosophy shifted over time?
Really broadly speaking, I think the way I think about it is, marketing requires a different set of skills, right? There's left brain, right brain. There's some people are better at content, creative, and messaging and branding. And usually that skill tends to be like, if you're strong in that area, you tend to be weaker in the technical aspects of attribution and getting your pixel set up properly and designing the campaigns, your bidding strategy. First is just recognizing that there's very different roles, right, in a marketing team. I think that's helpful in just figuring like you're never going to find, it's not never, but it's very hard to find a unicorn who can do everything. And so
find them.
What's that?
I said, and they're expensive if you do find them.
They're very rare. It's hard for someone who's like a brand genius who can also understand like how to install a pixel properly, or why like your ads are getting rejected. So so with that in mind, I think just if you can separate out the role and know that the technical piece is a separate skill from the traditional marketing piece, as marketing has traditionally been understood and defined, then you can think about, okay, who do you want full-time and who do you want part-time, right? The full-time people are people you really want to be stewards of the company. They're bought in, they have equity in the company. They really live and breathe with the brand. They believe in the mission, because if you believe in the mission, it comes out in your social media messaging and the design, all those sorts of things. I think increasingly the more technical aspects of growth marketing are actually better outsourced for two reasons. One is those skills are being separated, right? Like copywriting and instrumenting Google campaigns are different skills. That's one thing. But two, the very best technical marketers from a Facebook and Google standpoint, they all want to be, they don't like being stuck with one company, right? They kind of enjoy, there's a certain archetype to them where they all kind of learn Google and learn Facebook themselves. They were self-taught. They didn't go to school for this. They like being independent. And so it's hard to find someone who's really gifted in the technical areas of Facebook and Google, who's also wants, a traditional career. And so I would say over the last three years or so, I kind of recognized that shift and just changed my strategy around, okay, we don't, when it comes to certain roles, you don't need people who just bleed blue and gold or whatever the colors or the mission of the company is. It's really like, okay, I need you to make sure we set up this campaign properly so that when I run a messaging experiment, I know with confidence that the results I get back are accurate, whether it worked or not.
Right. So, I mean, it's almost like you're separating it into this binary where it's like, people who can take on and help build the personality of the brand, which tends to be more that creative type, that kind of brand focus, versus the people who can help set up proper attribution, make sure the data is accurate, can help explain and translate that data for everyone. And it sounds like in your opinion, those folks don't necessarily need to be like as embedded within the brand, because like a lot of that work is sort of copy and paste. Every business, is a little bit different, but how you set up those analytics and what those might mean are often similar kind of processes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So I want to separate this question kind of in two, right? Because you were just talking quite a bit about, for companies who are just like starting up, right? So freelance help's really great for that. When you were at ZipRecruiter, you were using, some agency help to test new channels, and those strategies, might be different for startup organizations versus large organizations, right? And there's a lot of good reasons why. So I want to talk to you a little bit about like how you vet, interview marketing candidates, whether that is for full-time roles or freelance roles or even agencies. And then of course, caveating that with, it's likely a little bit different if you're, a startup versus an established organization, and kind of how you view trying to figure out, if the marketer before you, the freelancer before you, the agency before you, can do it, right? Can get the job.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is just to understand every role is really different and the skills required are very different. And so when you look for someone to design and craft email copy, I think that's a very different skill than segmentation. Now, some people can do both, but like first is recognizing what are the skills that correlate highly to success in this role. And then from that, you go back and say, okay, well, if I'm hiring for an email marketer, what do I need to look for, right? And also it's changed, right? Like, so it used to be that email marketing, you had to learn all these sophisticated tools and you had to know how to build the email templates and write the copy. Now with Klaviyo, it's so easy to send an email out and do segmentation. Like you can, it's pretty self-serve, but I'll use email as an example. For email, really, what I would focus on is someone who really understands the consumer journey and messaging and consumer psychology. I think that's much more valuable than necessarily knowing the 10,000 ways to segment a database. That's important too, but that skill is actually becoming more and more commoditized within email, right? So it's just for each channel breaking down, okay, if I need someone to do X, what are the skills that are required? And then when you go into the interview process, you want to use different heuristics interviewing is I think it's very different for each role. So the way you interview, the way you test for those skills, the way you look for experience, it really does vary by the role. I mean, I'll talk about Facebook and Google as an example where it's more technical. Facebook and Google, I tend to, because I think that's probably what most people are thinking about. It's like, oh, how do I find like a Facebook expert or a Google expert? I tend to look for people who, and this is not a robust study, but there seems to be a correlation between if you're good at instrumenting Google and Facebook, usually you're self-taught. You don't learn this in school. Like you don't go to a great college to learn Google and Facebook. So they're very smart, self-taught marketers, right? Who just like figure it out on their own. And so one is like I actually look for people who just don't have a seemingly impressive profile, but seem to have figured out and started their own businesses or create their own agency or just like somehow like hack the web themselves. So that's one correlating factor that I found to be true in my hiring experience. The other one is, just an interest in analytics and in gaming and just being just mathematically oriented, because it's really like, to me, like Facebook and Google, it's just a video game. and there's like a lot of buttons to press, but if you're really good at some MMO, then you're probably good at doing growth marketing, because a lot of it is just like, how do you optimize and allocate resources, and how do you watch these numbers, and how do you run experiments? And it's very similar to playing a game,
Right.
a video game.
It is so funny that you say that. I've talked about that with our editor-in-chief a lot, where I'm like, we have to write this article because all of the best marketers that I know have been like obsessed with playing video games, and also have gotten really good at them. And I'm not even just talking about like now and like your current professional life, but one of my like favorite SEOers ever, he at one point in time was number 3 in the world at Tony Hawk. I know a variety of different people who got very, very good at Sim City, and not like the newer versions, right? The like early 2000 versions of it, which is that resource allocation like mentality. So I'm completely there with you, which is I think marketing in general is a lot like just playing a game, but like a game with the internet.
It's just it's numbers on a screen and a lot of buttons, and it's just optimization and arithmetic and day in and day out. And so when you find someone who's just oriented that way, they tend to be good. But you obviously look for a track record. I like finding people who started their own businesses, because if you're that good at marketing, why haven't you sold something online, right? Even if it's like a commodity product, if you're so good at marketing, you can arbitrage a lot of things on the internet. So that's also a correlating factor, which brings me to the point of, it's hard to find great Facebook and Google marketers who really, really want to join companies full time, because the truly gifted ones they're just kind of lone rangers operating in the wild.
Well, I mean, that brings me to a great question then. I mean, how do you think about or help others think through whether a hire needs to be a full-time hire, a freelancer, an agency? Like, do you have kind of a model for thinking through that?
Yeah, a little bit, but it's always evolving. I mean, I think on the agency side, it really depends on the channel. I think for digital, you really don't need an agency, because you're just getting, if you talk to an agency, the person selling you is just doing the selling. They're not actually doing the real work. And really what you want to do is like interview the guy or the gal who's doing the day-to-day work in these systems. But digital is so self-serve, and it's really, since it's like a video game, you just need to find the dude or the gal or that person, right? I think for offline channels, it is helpful to have, I mean, it depends on the channel, right? So like podcasts, for example, there are marketplaces like Midroll where it's fairly automated. You can kind of find media yourself, evaluate the ratings, the demographics, and you can buy media yourself. But other areas like radio, right? Let's say like local radio is like a good example, where if you need an agency, not necessarily because you need them to help you recruit. Like, so for a digital agency, really what you're doing when you hire an agency is that you're outsourcing your recruiting job by saying, hey, you guys are recruiting. I'm going to save myself time recruit. I'm going to trust that you're doing good recruiting. But I think for other channels like local radio, that's one example. The agency really does provide value in the supply chain by aggregating all of these small local stations, doing all the back and forth coordination. A lot of it isn't digital yet, so there's a lot of paperwork, phone calls, and negotiation. It's just not efficient like digital channels are. So I think an agency, it's for me, like evaluating an agency is really about, okay, well, what channel are you trying to tackle?
Right. It's like something niche, right? Like almost the more niche that agency can get,
if the agency is doing more than just recruiting a junior person or mid-level person who's helping you like day to day, then there's some value inherent in the dynamics of the channel, right? Like, so going back to local radio again, local radio is extremely fragmented. You need an agency to aggregate all of that media so that if you have $1 million campaign, you can roll it out across multiple markets, and you just don't have the expertise to do so. Compare that to Facebook. It's an hour of work to like set up a campaign. Not that little, but it's just different, right? So the role of an agency changes depending on the channel you're looking at.
So I love all of this like advice. I think it's very helpful, but I also really want to talk about like the way people ultimately come to have good advice and to be able to help others is by doing it wrong a few times. Can you talk to me about, a point in time in which you've, like whether it's full-time freelancer, agency, whatever, but when you just like hired the wrong fit and what you learned from that experience to take with you?
100%. And it evolves because the marketing landscape is evolving all the time, right? So like the hiring strategy needs to evolve with how the marketing is changing, as well as how the talent within marketing is changing. I tried to get someone who was really good at Facebook to join full time when really he should have been a freelancer, and you could just tell. And by the way, like any good Facebook marketer or Google marketer is freelancing, and so I had them join full time. I felt like they weren't emotionally committed to the company I was helping and leading at the time. And I could tell, just the obsession around figuring things out, making sure we threw the ringer to just try and make marketing work. It just wasn't there. Like he was there more to execute on the mechanical aspects of Facebook and Google, but not to really work with the team to figure out, okay, how do we really make this work? So that's one example where I kind of took an old mental model of, I need everyone to be fully on board, mission driven, and I brought someone on and they just weren't. And it's not their fault. It's just that I think there's a pool of talent that has a skill that enjoys freedom, and I think I'm more willing to accept that now and bifurcate people in the company who need to be really on board with the mission and people who are really supplementing our ability to execute.
Right. I mean, how do you think about the future of work, the future of hiring. And you sound like somebody who is very agile in your mindset in terms of who to bring onto the team, when, where, and why, and like you're learning really along the way. So I mean, I'd be interested, like, what do you think the next, 5 years of how people change how they work begins to unfold?
Yeah, I think it's flexibility and specialization. Flexibility because the root of everything is that the world is changing faster and faster, right? Facebook, Google, podcasts, like these new platforms are constantly releasing new features. The way commerce is changing is constantly changing. And so because there's so much rapid change, as any individual, CMO or marketing leader, you're not going to be able to keep up with every single little change. And so you want to lean into specialists who know their channels really well, and also new people who are figuring out things on the bleeding edge, right? Because you get outdated quickly. Because someone who was good at Facebook 10 years ago, they may not be on top of all the latest Instagram features and what's happening with social commerce, for example, right? So I think specialization is important to lean into, and then flexibility, because channels change all the time. What might work today will change later on. I won't point out which company, but one of the companies I was at, one channel worked really, really well for 3 years, and then it stopped working because the media got more expensive, right? Or in the current company that I co-founded with my wife, Facebook will work for 3 months and then stop working. And so we need to be flexible and nimble and be able to adapt with how the landscape is changing. The other thing is that these platforms have a lot of power and control, and if you're a smaller business, sometimes you don't have all the leverage either. And so you just want to stay nimble and flexible and be able to diversify your efforts.
Yeah. For someone starting a company right now who knows that they need some marketing help, I mean, what would be, like, if you had one piece of advice for them, what would you tell them?
I think before you jumping into channels, it's like, well, what is my product? What's the problem I'm solving? How is my product solving that problem? And who am I solving this problem for? And where do I reach those people? That's the first. You can't skip marketing fundamentals. I think a lot of people say, oh, TikTok is the new thing. Go market on TikTok. Well, if your demographic is 60-year-olds, like they're not on TikTok yet. So I think the marketing fundamentals still matter a lot, right? But first is just figuring out, like, how do you reach your audience and what's your messaging? And then once you kind of know the strategy, then you can piece out, okay, I do need to reach people on Facebook, but I don't know Facebook. So let me go find that expert in Facebook. And again, because you're starting off, you don't know if it'll work or not. I've found what's most useful is just you find a freelancer, construct a very small engagement, try it out, and see if it works. If it works, then you can engage them more, and you may outgrow them, but that's the easiest sort of frictionless way to start.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, I mean, Ed, that's all that I had for you today. Other than that, I mean, everybody who's sitting here listening, if you do need freelance help, MarketerHire can certainly help with that. But Ed, I appreciate it. This was all very, very helpful. I also just appreciate in general, like, your personal, flexible, and like agile focused mind, and the way you approach things. It's very, very refreshing, and I think gonna do you well in this changing world that we are all in.
Hope so.